22 years before the Battle of Yavin, the Clone Wars began on the planet Geonosis, when the Grand Army of the Republic invaded the planet to prevent CIS troop transports from departing with deadly cargoes of battle droids. This invasion sparked 3 years of galactic war, and it thrust what had previously been an obscure planet into the spotlight. Geonosis had been known to the Republic for many years, but it had long been considered a backwater, avoided due to its harsh climate and xenophobic locals. Even after its major role in the Separatist war effort made more people aware of it, most people still didn't know much about Geonosis, as the planet remained mostly closed off to the galaxy. But despite what its desolate surface might suggest, Geonosis was a unique and fascinating world, and in this video, we'll be taking a comprehensive look at the planet and its people, the Geonosians.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Geonosis was located in the Geonosis system, a little visited stop in the Arcana sector of the Outer Rim territories. It was located on the Crystal Passage, a hyperspace route that connected a string of mining worlds at the rimward end of the Arcana sector on its way from Tatooine to the neighboring Hunovers sector. Geonosis was located just a parsec away from Tatooine, the Arcana sector's most well-known planet, and like its close neighbor, it was located in a part of the sector that fell just beyond the de facto borders of the Republic. Unlike Tatooine, however, Geonosis was mostly ignored by the Hutts and other outlaws that controlled the rest of the Arcana sector, and it was generally left alone by the galaxy until the eve of the Separatist crisis. The heart of the Geonosis sector was a star named Ea, which was orbited by 6 planets. Geonosis occupied the second orbit. Closer to the sun was an airless rock named Geras, while further out were the volcanic planet Conus, the toxic terrestrial world Mabonte, the gas giant Habon, and the frozen dwarf planet Abysissa. Apart from Geonosis, none of these planets could support life, and they were mostly unexplored, even by the Geonosians. Geonosis itself was a barren terrestrial planet with a ring system composed of the rocky remnants of an ancient moon, which was destroyed millions of years before the Clone Wars in a cataclysm. Geonosis also had a staggering 15 intact moons. 4 of these were major, full-size moons, while the other 11 were minor moons, possibly larger chunks of the destroyed moon that formed Geonosis's rings. The planet had a dense but breathable nitrogen-oxygen atmosphere and a diameter of 11,370 kilometers. Its molten core was disproportionately small, and as a result, its gravity was rated at 90% standard, which was lighter than most planets, but not enough to be terribly noticeable. A Geonosian day was 30 hours long, and a Geonosian year lasted 256 local days. It was a hot planet with an arid climate, and most of its surface was desolate and rocky. It did have water, however. Roughly 5% of the planet's surface was covered by it, and aquifers could be found underground. These overflowed during the planet's annual rainy season in devastating flash floods, carving canyons and other impressive rock formations out of the planet's rugged crust. Some sources suggest that Geonosis, much like Tatooine, was a lush and pleasant world in the distant past, before its surface was ravaged by an ancient cataclysm. Unlike with Tatooine, however, Geonosis's cataclysm wasn't caused by the Rakata. It was instead caused by a wayward 2-kilometer wide comet which struck and destroyed Geonosis's largest moon millions of years before the Clone Wars. This event created Geonosis's eye-catching ring system and unleashed devastation upon the planet's surface. While most of the debris from this impact settled into the planet's rings or was ejected from Geonosis's orbit, some of it struck Geonosis itself, subjecting the planet to a rain of destructive meteorites. This bombardment devastated the planet's surface and wiped out 99% of the species that called Geonosis home. Ever after, Geonosis remained a pretty hellish place. Asteroid bombardments remained frequent, as many of the rocks that made up the planet's rings had unstable orbits, causing them to periodically fall into the Geonosian gravity well and cause additional mass extinctions. Even then, asteroid impacts were only one of the many challenges Geonosian lifeforms faced. Geonosis's small molten core meant that it had a weak magnetic field, and as a consequence, its surface was constantly scoured by lethal storms of solar radiation. Additionally, the water cycle in Geonosis functioned strangely. Geonosis usually only saw rain once a year, when the planet would be subjected to long torrential downpours that caused massive flooding. During the rest of the year, moisture steadily built up in the planet's upper atmosphere, forming dense fog that could block out the sun for weeks at a time, causing what the Geonosians called long nights. The sun could also be blocked out by sandstorms, which were common in Geonosis's desert basins. Most of the planet's surface was covered by rocky highlands or sprawling red sand deserts, similar to Tatooine. The highlands were eroded into dramatic landforms by the planet's annual floods, carved into mesas, badlands, and mountains riven by vast canyons and valleys, and they were scattered across Geonosis's surface with stretches of desert between them. During the annual floods, the low-lying desert basins were often completely flooded, temporarily transformed into shallow seas. This didn't last long, however. The floodwaters quickly evaporated or drained into large subterranean aquifers, carving enormous networks of caves and tunnels deep into Geonosis's crust as they did so. Not all of Geonosis's water was trapped underground, however. It did have a few large bodies of water on the surface, including the scum-choked Ebon Sea, which was home to amphibious mutant acklays. The Geonosian surface was also strewn with craters from asteroid impacts, as well as volcanically active regions, among them the Narrakti lava fields. Between its barren terrain, massive floods, radiation storms, and asteroid impacts, Geonosis was pretty hostile to most forms of complex life. But it had life nonetheless, descended from those few species that survived the mass extinction caused by the original asteroid bombardment millions of years prior. These hardy survivors had been further culled by many mass extinctions since, ensuring that only those species that were particularly tough, cunning, and/or ruthless were left alive by the time of the Clone Wars. Even then, many of these species had to live deep underground in order to survive Geonosis's radiation storms. Only species that were naturally hardened against radiation in some fashion could live on the surface. Very little is known about Geonosian flora, apart from the fact that there wasn't all that much of it. The most common surface flora were a few hardy species of red rock algae, which were fairly widespread across the planet's highland regions. Geonosis's caves were a bit more lively, hosting numerous varieties of fungi, some of which were cultivated by the Geonosians. Other fungi species grew on the surface, including spider sponges, which grew in the exhaust vents of Geonosian droid factories, feeding on the noxious fumes welling up from below. And that's not all. We have much more information about Geonosian fauna. Geonosis was home to many creatures, including a large variety of small insects. These included arc grubs, small creatures that, when lightly grilled, were considered a tasty snack by the Geonosians, cretals, a species of parasitic, burrowing arthropods that could also be found on Tatooine, and mips, another kind of small parasitic insect, which had a symbiotic relationship with the massive Murdeaths, which we'll talk about in a bit. Mip swarms followed Murdeaths across the Geonosian wastes, feeding on the ichor that accumulated on their undersides. In exchange, they led Murdeaths to food and attacked anything that tried to kill their hosts. Geonosis was also home to the Fidna, another parasitic insect species that could be found in Geonosis's caves and tunnels. The Geonosians cultivated Fidnas as a source of Fidna resin, a glowing orange goo that was highly explosive in its raw form, as well as for their dung. The Geonosians combined Fidna dung with stone powder in order to make rock paste, which was initially very malleable but hardened into rock over time. The Geonosians used this substance to build their hives, making Fidnas very valuable to them. Fans of Star Wars: The Clone Wars no doubt remember that Geonosis was also home to a species of brainworms, a parasitic species that had a special relationship with Geonosian hive queens. Brainworms were imprinted with the biologically archived memories of Geonosian queens, allowing them to act as extensions of their masters even after the queens themselves were dead. After hatching from their eggs, brainworms would invade the bodies of sentient beings, typically through the nostrils, and attach themselves to the victim's brainstem, allowing the Geonosian queen's implanted memories to control the victim's nervous system. The way the Geonosian nervous system worked meant that brainworms could also be used to reanimate Geonosian corpses to serve as mindless, undead drones for the Geonosian queens. Geonosis was also home to a number of larger but still reasonably sized creatures, among them the six-legged insectoid rogas, furred sand snakes, and reptilian dog-like massifs. All of these species lived in Geonosis's highlands, and of them, the massifs were by far the most significant. Massifs had coarse, leathery hides, rows of spines along their backs, large eyes and mouths, and sharp teeth. The Geonosians domesticated them for use as sentries, hounds, and pest control. They were tough and could be vicious, but when domesticated, they were loyal and dependable. The Geonosians also domesticated orays, another leathery-skinned species of reptiles. Orays were large, tough-skinned creatures known for their strength and speed. Their tails were tipped with deadly stingers and their mouths contained sharp teeth, making them dangerous for the unwary. Wild orays fed on Geonosian eggs, which they devoured by the thousands, but despite this, the Geonosians used tamed orays as beasts of burden and as mounts. They did this by removing the barbed tails of domesticated orays, which functioned similarly to castration in some other species, making orays more docile. Orays were fairly large animals by Geonosian standards, but they were still dwarfed by two enormous species that were likely the apex predators of Geonosis. One was the Geonosian hydra, an enormous three-headed carnivorous insectoid with vestigial wings, at least 6 limbs, and sharp mandibles. These lived in the murky depths of Geonosis's few bodies of water, but they were amphibious and often left the water to hunt. Geonosian hydras were known to attack Geonosian hives, climbing up their spires and snatching Geonosian warriors out of the air to feast on. Geonosis's other massive predator was the Murdeth, a titanic arthropod the size of a freighter. Murdeths had huge, bulbous armored shells which were virtually impenetrable, and they scuttled about on hundreds of little legs. Their heads were small, armored, and triangular, and a set of 8 tentacles protruded from them, grabbing food and shoveling it into the Murdeth's maw. These monsters ate everything organic, and though they were fairly slow, they were pretty much unstoppable. The Geonosians had developed a clever method for culling their numbers, however. Every year, on the eve of the annual floods, they would dispatch droids to draw as many Murdeths as possible out into the desert basins, where they would get caught in the floods and drown. The Geonosians could carve up the dead Murdeths once the floods subsided, harvesting their meat and leaving their shells to ornament the deserts. Geonosis was also home to Urgreedles, an insectoid relative of the Geonosians. These creatures were similar to Geonosians, but semi-sentient, smaller, and unsophisticated, sort of how apes are in relation to humans. Urgreedles had tough, crimson exoskeletons, clawed digits for digging, and 6 leathery wings. Hives of Urgreedles built dirt mounds to live in, which were basically primitive versions of Geonosian hive spires. Urgreedles were infamously attracted to shiny objects, and a large number of them even made off with the lightsabers of fallen Jedi after the Battle of Geonosis. The Geonosians also imported a number of creatures for their warriors to battle in their arenas, and some of these managed to escape captivity and establish populations in Geonosis's wastelands. In particular, there were several populations of escaped Acklays on Geonosis, including one that had mutated into a new subspecies as a result of exposure to toxic sludge in the Ebon Sea. These mutant Acklays were amphibious and lived like crocodiles in the murky waters of the Ebon Sea, feasting on whatever was foolish enough to get too close to the water's edge. But the most well-known species on Geonosis was the Geonosians themselves, the planet's only indigenous sentients. The Geonosians were an industrious, quasi-insectoid species renowned for their bloodthirstiness, their distrust of outsiders, and their skill at droid manufacturing. There were 100 billion of them on Geonosis at the start of the Clone Wars, packed into densely populated hives that wound deep below the planet's surface, where the Geonosians could take shelter from sandstorms and radiation. They were often classified as insectoids, But the term quasi-insectoid is more accurate, as they not only had a humanoid body plan, but also many physiological attributes that were unusual for insectoids. Geonosians were thin and not terribly muscular, with spindly arms and legs, of which they had 2 each. Geonosians' legs were triple-jointed, and they had tridactyl feet, with long toes that allowed them to cling tightly to rock crags. Their hands had 2 long fingers and a single opposable thumb each, and their elongated, drooping heads sat atop long, flexible necks. Geonosian eyes were bulbous, thick-lidded, and protruded somewhat from their faces, and unlike those of many insectoids, they weren't compound, being more similar to the eyes of humans. Prominently, most Geonosians had a set of 4 long, leathery wings which younger Geonosians could use to fly. Unusually for insectoids, Geonosians had both chitinous exoskeletons and bone endoskeletons. Their exoskeletons were covered by a layer of thin, leathery skin, and they were thicker in some places than other, sporting bony ridges for extra protection. This exoskeleton helped protect the Geonosians from the radiation storms that ravaged their homeworld's surface, though the Geonosians preferred to live underground for added protection all the same. Geonosians had yellowish-green blood, and some of them had small tusks protruding from either side of their mouths. Most Geonosians were surprisingly strong, and their exoskeletons allowed them to tank a decent amount of damage as well, making them capable manual laborers and warriors. They were also exceptionally agile, and their senses were keen, especially their sense of smell. Smell was vital for the Geonosians, as they produced pheromones that they could use to communicate. This was so important to the Geonosians that many pieces of Geonosian technology were even designed to produce artificial pheromones, which they could process more quickly and easily than spoken or written words. Nonetheless, the Geonosians had a conventional language as well, known as Geonosian. This language was based on click consonants, which made it difficult for some humans to understand. Non-Geonosians found this language difficult to speak as well, as the Geonosians spoke it using 2 sets of internal mandibles in their mouths, one vertical and one horizontal, which humans and most other species lacked. Nonetheless, non-Geonosians could mimic the spoken part of Geonosian well enough to communicate. In turn, Geonosians were capable of speaking Galactic Basic, but few ever did. Though most Geonosian aristocrats understood Basic, they typically still insisted on speaking their own tongue. Like many insectoids, Geonosians were divided into biologically distinct castes, and they were dependent on a queen caste for reproduction. All of these castes followed similar life cycles, however. They started life as eggs laid by the queens, from which they hatched as larvae. Geonosian larvae quickly matured into pupas, and it was in this stage that Geonosians were indoctrinated into their role in Geonosian society. They fully matured within 6 to 7 years, past which they were considered adults. Geonosians were considered elderly over the age of 50, and it was rare for them to live longer than 65 years. Even the age of 50 was usually only attainable by aristocrats. Older Geonosians could be distinguished by the long facial wattles that grew from their chins and cheeks, which appeared similar to long, fleshy beards, and by the bony crests that grew on their heads. As a Geonosian aged, they also steadily lost use of their wings. While young adult Geonosians were capable of sustained flight, in middle age they could usually only glide in short bursts, and old Geonosians lost use of their wings entirely. The Geonosians were incredibly intelligent, and they were exceptional at solving puzzles or fixing machinery. But despite their intelligence, most Geonosians didn't have much of a sense of individuality or personality, and they could be weak-willed and lacking in independence, though they were still immune to Jedi mind tricks due to the structures of their brains. The main exceptions to this rule were the aristocrats, who were not only more individualistic and independent, but also much more egotistical. Nonetheless, all Geonosians to some extent or another had a strong hive mentality, which was reinforced for the lower castes through extensive conditioning. This mentality made most Geonosians very subservient, and it also made them extremely xenophobic. The Geonosians were fiercely loyal to their hive, and usually to its rulers as well, while they distrusted or despised anyone that wasn't part of their hive, no matter whether they were aliens or members of other Geonosian hives. Even Geonosians that regularly dealt with off-worlders or lived on other planets struggled to hide their contempt for non-Geonosians. Geonosian society was based on a strict caste hierarchy, with members of some castes being genetically engineered to be able to better serve their designated roles. The rarest and most important caste was the Geonosian queens, which were responsible for laying new clutches of eggs. Mature queens were massive and immobile, hidden away in the darkest depths of the Geonosian catacombs, and they were physically distinct from other Geonosians. Queens' upper bodies resembled those of ordinary Geonosians, albeit with 6 arms and a large fan-shaped head crest, but their lower bodies were massive, bulbous oviposters. The queens could lay 1 egg every 8 seconds, and their primary function in the Geonosian hives was to constantly lay more eggs to maintain the hive's population. Some queens also had a great level of authority and influence within their hives, but it was rare for queens to actually take a role in administration. That job usually fell to the aristocracy. Most of the time, the queen's sole function in the hive was reproduction. Most hives had a single queen at a time, though they had a number of backup queen eggs on hand in suspended animation in case the queen was killed suddenly. These eggs took years to raise to maturity, however, and hives would be crippled if left without a queen for that long. Consequently, the Geonosians were fiercely protective of their queens, assigning legions of drones to tend to them and keeping their existence a secret from off-worlders. In at least one case, Geonosian queens were guarded by deceased warrior drones that had been reanimated by brainworms, which were enough to deter most assailants. The remaining Geonosian castes were physically similar, and they were led by the aristocrats, the rulers of the Geonosian hives. Aristocrats were winged and physically indistinguishable from winged warrior drones, but they were generally more intelligent than most Geonosians, as well as much more arrogant. Members of the aristocrat caste were open in their disdain for the lower castes, which they saw as inferior, existing only to serve the aristocrats. They thought nothing of condemning the other Geonosians to die in petty wars or work themselves to death, and all while they enjoyed lives of ease and luxury, reaping tremendous profits from their subjects' productivity. Aristocrats were fiercely competitive, and though some of them had combat training, they rarely got their hands dirty themselves, instead dispatching warriors to do their killing for them. The aristocrats made up roughly 5% of any given hive's population, and they had absolute authority over their hive, overseeing all responsibilities of state. All Geonosians who weren't queens or aristocrats were considered drones, condemned to spend their lives serving the aristocrats. Drones were indoctrinated to be dependent on higher authority, and they usually weren't even given names. There were 2 castes of drones, the winged warrior caste and the wingless worker caste. The warrior caste was the higher ranking of the two, and they were treated better than the worker drones, though their lives were still harsh. Warrior drones handled hive defense, guard and patrol duties, and offensive action against enemies of the hive, and they usually answered to aristocrat commanders. They were raised to be single-minded, relentless, and fearless, and they usually fought in swarms, foregoing complex tactics in favor of overwhelming force. The warrior caste was divided into a number of subcastes, some of which were genetically modified for specific purposes. Apart from the standard Geonosian soldier drones, there were specialized Geonosian pilots who lacked wings but were still considered part of the warrior caste. Pilots were genetically engineered to not need sleep, and as pupas, they were paired with a starfighter's flight computer, which was personalized to them. The pilot and their computer developed a rapport as the pilot matured, which greatly improved Geonosian pilots' performance in combat. There were also Geonosian elites, the most feared Geonosian warriors, which were heavily genetically modified and well armed. They had armored hides, 4 legs instead of 2, and long tusks, and they were armed with fearsome beam weapons fueled by their own bodily fluids. Geonosian elites apparently outranked ordinary Geonosian warriors, but apart from this distinction, Geonosian warriors lacked a ranking system, and they weren't organized into formalized standing armies. At the bottom of the Geonosian hierarchy were the wingless worker drones, who were brutally oppressed by the higher castes. Wingless Geonosians were considered casteless sub-Geonosians by the aristocrats, valueless except as menial laborers. They had no rights and worked in hellish environments. It was common for them to be worked to death. They had no possessions, lived in cramped communal barracks, and they were often put into suspended animation when their services weren't needed. There were 5 subcastes of the worker caste, each engineered for specific tasks. Service drones spent their lives as household slaves for the aristocrats, farmer drones cultivated the Geonosians' food supply, maker drones were assigned to manufacturing, labor drones were assigned to construction or low-skill industrial activities, and overseer drones bossed all the others around, relaying orders from the aristocrats. The only sanctioned way drones could escape these miserable lives was through gladiatorial combat, the only means of social mobility in the rigid Geonosian caste system. All castes lived together in hives spread across Geonosis. The hives functioned as fiercely independent nation-states, but despite this, they were all generally interchangeable, and they were differentiated pretty much exclusively by their queens and by the ambitions of their aristocrats. All hives subsisted primarily on fungi grown by drones in enormous underground gardens and water from subterranean aquifers, which they supplemented with murderth meat and other foodstuffs acquired in trade. Other drones managed enormous hive factories, most of them geared toward the production of droids, which the Geonosians sold on the galactic market and used to bolster their hives' defenses and productive capabilities. Geonosian hives lived in enormous city-like complexes. These were mostly subterranean, but most nonetheless featured large citadels topped with sharp, needle-like spires on the surface. These were based on the primitive mounds the Geonosians' ancient ancestors once built, but they were far larger and more ornate. These spires and their rocky bases were made out of hardened rock paste shaped around a lamina steel skeleton, and from the outside, they looked like natural formations. Geonosian spires were designed to be highly defensible against marauding beasts. The armies of rival hives, or alien attacks, and they also served a number of other practical purposes. Spires worked as cooling chimneys, venting waste heat from the living areas and factories below, and some also doubled as grand formal entrances to the hive. Though they looked rough and primitive on the outside, on the inside, Geonosian hive spires were highly ornate. They were usually hollow, built with vaulted windows, grand galleries and balconies, decorative arches and pillars, and other grandiose architectural marvels. The hive's aristocrats typically met with off-worlders and dignitaries from other hives in their hive's grand entrance spire, taking them on walks of the galleries to impress them. From the entrance spire, potential clients could get brief glimpses of the interior of the hive's factory complex before being taken to boardrooms built just off the main spire, which the Geonosians used for signing contracts. Other such visitor spaces were typically located in the base of the rock formations the spires were built atop, adjacent to hangars of various sizes for visiting spacecraft. The hives were heavily industrialized, and nearly all of them maintained vast factories. These were typically built just below the surface, allowing waste gases to be vented to the surface through spires and through secondary vents carved into the rock formations surrounding them. These sprawling industrial hellscapes were usually more than a kilometer deep, and they had next to no safety infrastructure, which meant that Geonosian drones were regularly killed by the machinery. Grimy and dangerous as they were, these places were extremely productive, allowing the Geonosians to churn out vast quantities of droids, tanks, starfighters, and other products. The droid factories of the Stalgason Hive in particular could churn out thousands of battle droids every single day. To maintain such output, of course, the Geonosian factories required a vast amount of raw material input. They typically sourced the required metal ores from the iron-rich asteroid rocks that made up Geonosis' ring system, but when undertaking large contracts, they also imported vast amounts of raw materials from other systems, often through organizations like the Trade Federation. Once the ore reached the factories, it was crushed and liquefied using a super laser, then processed and shaped into various parts, which were assembled into completed products. This process was almost entirely automated, overseen by a relatively small force of Geonosian worker drones who rested in storage alcoves adjacent to the factory proper between their shifts. During the waning years of the Republic, the Geonosians' droid factories were connected by large transport tunnels to vast loading fields, where huge numbers of droids could be loaded en masse to bulk transports docked in specialized pits, which dotted the low-lying basins around the hives. These loading fields were overseen by remote outposts manned by Geonosian warriors, as well as small hangars equipped with rapid response fighters, all to ensure the security of the Geonosians' clients. In most hives, the main living areas for the worker drones were clustered around the factories, while the nests of the higher castes were located on the level below, far from the ravages of radiation storms and the fumes of the factory. On this lower level were the gathering spaces and nests of the Geonosian aristocrats, and their opulence put the cramped warrens of the drones to shame. Below the aristocrats' living chambers were vast cave systems carved out by underground streams, where Geonosian drones tended to the Hives' farms. Most of these farms were given over to the cultivation of edible fungi and were watered by streams and aquifers, though the Geonosians also built hydroponic gardens where they raised fidnas. Below the farms, on the deepest levels of the Geonosian hives, were the dark chambers where the queens were tended by their drone legions. All of these different levels of the hives were connected and ringed by enormous networks of catacombs. These tunnel networks were all connected to one another, forming one massive complex that covered the entire planet and connected all the hives. Geonosian warriors constantly patrolled these tunnels to fend off saboteurs, assassins, and rival raiders. During wars between the hives, which were fairly common due to the Geonosians' xenophobic attitudes and their aristocrats' willingness to throw the lives of drones away, most of the fighting took place down in the tunnels. This was the reason why the Geonosians preferred sonic weaponry. Such weapons obliterated organic targets, but not rock, eliminating the risk of stray shots causing tunnel collapses. All told, hives were constantly active, rigidly structured, and highly oppressive. It was a world that offered little escape to those trapped in its lower castes, and it appeared to many outsiders that the Geonosian drones had simply accepted their place in society and were content with it. But this was far from the case. Indeed, many drones took notice of the fact that their jobs could be just as easily done by the millions of droids their hives churned out, and this caused them to resent their status. As a consequence of this, not long before the Clone Wars, the drones of the Golba hive staged a full-scale revolution against the aristocrats. The aristocrats were utterly outmatched, and in an act of bitter, suicidal vengeance, they destroyed their entire hive with proton bombs to prevent the drones from liberating themselves. The entire Golba hive was destroyed, in the process unleashing chemical weapons that the hive's engineers had been testing for use in Hellfire droid warheads. The result was Golba's Pit, a massive crater filled with a black, bubbling, toxic sludge which contaminated the nearby Eben Sea. Nonetheless, the story of Golba Hive's fall was a cause for concern for the aristocrats of the other hives. Proof that the drones made up the vast majority of Geonosian society and were entirely capable of self-liberation. Drones were so heavily conditioned that they rarely attempted that, however. Attempts to escape Geonosian society altogether were even rarer, for the Geonosian hive mentality was so strong that most Geonosians preferred to be slaves in the company of their hive mates than free among outsiders. Geonosis had no united planetary government, but by the time of the Clone Wars, one of the hives was powerful enough that it was able to effectively speak on behalf of the planet. This was the Stalgesan hive, the domain of Queen Karina the Great and Archduke Poggle the Lesser, which led the other hives of Geonosis in allying with the CIS. The Stalgesan hive was the first Geonosian hive to build a droid factory, and its factories remained the largest and most advanced on the planet up until the time of the Clone Wars. This gave the Stalgesan hive an edge over its rivals, and by the time of the Clone Wars, a number of smaller hives were essentially its vassals, their affairs dictated by Poggle the Lesser's right-hand man, Sun Fuck. Many of these hives saw it as an insult that the Stalgesan Archduke had a lieutenant manage their affairs instead of attending to them directly, something Sun Fuck was aware of and enjoyed rubbing in the faces of the lesser hives' aristocrats. The Stalgesan hive wasn't completely unopposed, however. It had a number of rivals, the most powerful of which was the Gehenba hive, ruled by the ambitious aristocrat Typtus of the 33rd Egg. The Stalgesan hive's main spires and droid factories were located in the Imgatwe Hills, which made up the core of Stalgesan territory. Numerous spire complexes, as well as military hangars and outposts, dotted the various ranges of hills in this region, while the flats between were converted into landing fields for Trade Federation core ships and the smaller troop transports of other separatist factions. To the west of this core region was the vast Iak Desert, which was also Stalgesan hive territory all the way out to the Badlands of Nigzi. These Badlands were once home to a satellite factory complex, long since abandoned in the Negyor Valley, part of which was later converted into a private hangar for Count Dooku. Other locations in Stalgason Hive territory included the Progate Temple, the Separatist Council War Room, and the Petranaki Arena. That last location, a large arena built on the edge of a high mesa, was one of the most important places on Geonosis, as ritual combats were a cherished part of Geonosian culture. The Geonosians loved bloodshed and held skilled warriors in high esteem, and their main outlet for bloodlust was through regular spectacles at public arenas, where gladiators or condemned prisoners would demonstrate the violent art of Petranaki against other Geonosians or fearsome beasts. This tradition, the Geonosians claimed, traced back to prehistory when the mythical giants known as the Hive Overlords grew angry at the Geonosians' endless hive wars and taught the Hives the art of gladiatorial combat as an alternative. Even after, the Geonosian aristocrats regularly held Petranaki displays or public executions in the arenas, and the Geonosian drones came to love these events, as arena fights, along with a few holidays, were pretty much the only times they got a break from their duties. Many different kinds of combat took place in the Petranaki arenas. Traditionally, Petranaki gladiators fought other gladiators, battle droids, or savage massifs, while new droid models and soldier hatchlings would fight staged battles against lesser opponents, and prisoners sentenced to death would be chained to pillars, left to be mauled by fearsome monsters. Some fights were choreographed, and the arena could be filled with obstacles to spice up combats. The arena could even be flooded for staged naval battles. During the reign of the Stalgason Archduke Haddas the Vaulted, however, some Petranaki displays began to combine elements of these events, having gladiator drones go up against accolades and other monsters to the delight of the crowd. These monster fights quickly became the most popular spectacles, and outsiders who traded with Geonosians quickly learned that they could earn the Geonosians' appreciation by giving them exotic monsters for use in the arena. The Stalgason Hive Petranaki Arena housed many such fearsome beasts, among them Acklays, Nexus, Mongworsts, and Reeks. Petranaki combat was revered in Geonosian society, and it was the sole sanctioned means of social mobility for lower caste Geonosians. Drones who volunteered to fight in the arenas and managed to survive would gain considerable prestige, and the greatest of gladiators would earn the right to live like aristocrats, though they were still of lower authority. Even wingless Geonosians could earn prestige and wealth in this matter, and for those few Geonosian drones that were determined to escape Geonosis altogether, fighting in that arena was their ticket to the stars. Most who achieved some measure of success in the arena instead became picadors who would ride tamed ores and use static pikes to keep the arena beasts in line during executions and fights. For traditional Petranaki combat, gladiators were allowed to select one of 5 traditional weapons, collectively known as the Petranaki array. The most popular was the Petranaki scimitar, a curved, lightweight, razor-sharp sword. The others were the Picador's spear, a long, static pike with an electrified tip, the Beast Warden's shield, a round bronzium disc rimmed with spikes, the Confessor's whip, a 3-tailed whip lined with serrated barbs coated with nerve toxins, and the Caster's net, an electrified net meant to be thrown at an opponent. These traditional weapons were far from the only Geonosian weapons, however. Static pikes, similar to the Picador's spear, were commonly used by Geonosian warriors, as were shorter, non-electrified spears, bladed force pikes, and electro staffs. The Geonosians also made a number of blaster models, and Geonosian elites wielded exotic beam weapons that fired concentrated energy beams derived from the wielder's bodily fluids. The most infamous Geonosian weapon, however, was the Geonosian Sonic Blaster, a meter-long carbine that fired compacted sonic waves ensconced in a plasma cocoon. When these projectiles struck a target, the plasma sphere would rupture, unleashing an explosive blast of sonic waves in all directions. This weapon was simply devastating against organic targets, painfully liquefying their internal organs upon a direct hit. But it was ineffective against stone, which made it ideal for use in catacomb warfare. The Geonosians also made sonic mines and artillery based on the same principle, including the LR-1K sonic cannon, a stationary dual-operator artillery piece, which fired larger and more powerful sonic balls that could pulverize groups of infantry or even light vehicles. All of these different weapons were manufactured by Gordal Weaponsmiths, a Geonosian firm that was part of the Geonosian Industries, a techno-union member company run by the Stalgason Hive aristocracy. Another subsidiary of the Geonosian Industries, the Hapla Tisk Shipwrights Collective, manufactured starships and other vehicles for the Geonosians' use. This included the Nantex-class territorial defense starfighter, which was used to defend Hives against Murdeths and attacking Offworlders. Hapla Tisk also manufactured the Flitnot speederbike, the Geonovex-class fanblade starfighter, the Punwalker 116 class interstellar swoop, and several classes of capital ship, most notably the Separatist cruiser and the Geonosian dreadnought. Most of these craft were manufactured for the use of the Geonosians themselves, but the Hive factories did, of course, produce war machines to sell to outsiders as well, most famously for the Separatists. The Geonosians' first contact with Offworlders happened 4,000 years before the Clone Wars, not long after Zerka Corporation established its settlement on neighboring Tatooine. The Geonosians were suspicious of Offworlders and looked down on them, believing that any humanoid without wings was low caste and beneath them. At the same time, however, they were fascinated by the Offworlders' technology. They rapidly adopted many forms of alien technology and began building factories in their hives to mass produce their own versions of it, some for their own use and some to sell in trade. Before long, they were churning out labor droids built in their own image and selling them on the galactic market, where they were known for being cheap yet reliable. By the time of the Great Galactic War, outsiders were also coming to Geonosis to fight in the arenas, including one young warrior who would later claim the title of Mandalore. However, this initial period of contact with the galaxy didn't last. Zerka's mining operations on Tatooine dried up, and the planet was abandoned, cutting off trade to Geonosis and ending Republic contact with the Arcanus sector for a time. Companies in the core ripped off the Geonosians' innovations and began manufacturing labor droids of similar quality. And the Geonosian hives themselves were bitterly divided on the issue of whether or not they should have contact with Offworlders at all, a disagreement that escalated into a long period of global inter-hive warfare. This last development caused all remaining Offworld interests to abandon Geonosis, and the planet was forgotten by the Republic for a time. The Hive Wars raged for centuries, killing billions of Geonosian warriors and leaving the planet in chaos. But they did come to an end eventually, and Geonosis returned to the galactic stage. In the Republic's final centuries, scouts and traders re-established contact with the Geonosians, who rebuilt their factories and began to produce labor droids once more. They then signed a distribution contract with Bactoid Industries, a subsidiary of the Techno Union, which brought Geonosian droids back to the galactic market. Geonosis remained a mostly obscure world, but it soon caught the attention of Darth Sidious, who was impressed with the Geonosians' engineering skills, which he believed were wasted on labor droids. He sought to use the Geonosians to build a droid army for use in his plans, and, as fate would have it, the internal politics of the Stalgason Hive had given him a perfect opportunity to amass a degree of control over Geonosis. At that time, the oppressive and bloodthirsty Archduke of the Stalgason Hive, Hadis the Vaulted, faced a revolution led by a low-ranking soldier drone named Poggle. Poggle's revolution against Hadis had a decent amount of popular support, as the reigning Archduke was a brutal and iron-fisted ruler, but the rebels were low on resources. In 33 BBY, Poggle and his followers were on the brink of defeat when Sidious reached out and arranged for them to receive a large shipment of weapons, which Poggle used to stage a new offensive. The revolutionaries were ultimately victorious, and Poggle the Lesser, as he became known due to his low caste origins, became the Stalgason Hive's new Archduke. In celebration of his victory, Poggle rode an Acklay into the Petranaki arena on the eve of Mekyan, driving his mount to tear Hadis the Vaulted to pieces as the crowds cheered. Poggle fashioned a cane out of Hadis's leg bones, and he quickly brought the Stalgason aristocracy under his control. With his victory, Poggle was now indebted to Darth Sidious, who enlisted the Stalgason Hive to begin building an army of battle droids for his Trade Federation allies. Despite his personal hatred of Viceroy Newt Gunray, Poggle readily agreed, and he worked with the Trade Federation leadership, Bactoid Armor Workshop, and Bactoid Combat Automata to design part of the Trade Federation droid army. Geonosian engineers designed the B-1 battle droid in their image, and on Lord Sidious's request, Poggle also put them to work creating preliminary designs for the ultimate weapon, what would later become known as the Death Star. The Trade Federation's new droid army was defeated in the Battle of Naboo, but it inspired many other large megacorporations to begin building droid armies, and the Geonosians began supplying all of them. Many of them did this in defiance of Republic law, which is why they made contracts with the Geonosians. Since Geonosis lay outside Republic borders, regulators never inspected its facilities. This ultimately got the Geonosians involved in the separatist movement, whose leader, Count Dooku, secretly approached Archduke Poggle to commission what would become the CIS droid army. After Dooku demonstrated fealty to the Geonosian Hive Queens, Poggle agreed, committing every factory on Geonosis to building battle droids for the separatists, both B-1s and the new B-2 super battle droids, which Poggle had personally commissioned the design of. The Geonosians even established new off-world factory hives on Hypori, Zadja, and Zorn to expand their productive capabilities without attracting too much attention. In 24 BBY, the Confederacy of Independent Systems openly declared itself, beginning the separatist crisis and a wave of secessions from the Republic. Geonosis joined the Confederacy, the first time it had become a member of galactic government, and it quickly became one of the most important separatist worlds. As the separatist crisis heated up, Bactoid Armor Workshop and a number of other separatist-aligned droid manufacturers closed their factories within Republic space, secretly outsourcing their operations to Geonosis and other Outer Rim worlds outside the Republic's borders. In 22 BBY, Poggle the Lesser and Count Dooku met with the other members of the Separatist Council in a Stalgason Hive stateroom, where the gathered senators and corporate leaders pledged to pool their private militaries into the CIS droid army, the largest fighting force the galaxy had ever seen. However, Obi-Wan Kenobi managed to eavesdrop on this meeting and get word of it back to the Republic, starting a chain of events that led to the Battle of Geonosis. Without warning, the Republic's new clone army descended on Geonosis, bombarding its starfighter facilities from orbit and landing ground troops to destroy the docked separatist transports before they could take off. The Republic emerged triumphant from this first battle, but the clones were unable to prevent a majority of the transports, as well as the Separatist Council, from escaping, and so, the Clone Wars had only just begun. The Republic occupied Geonosis after the battle, seizing the Geonosians' droid factories and establishing tactical control of the planet's surface. But the clones were unable to make any headway into the Geonosian catacombs and the lower reaches of the Hives, allowing the Geonosians to rearm and eventually take back their planet. This led to a second Republic invasion of Geonosis in early 21 BBY, which led to a more thorough occupation of the planet, the death of Stalgason Queen Karina the Great, and the capture of Poggle the Lesser, though he eventually escaped Republic custody. Geonosis was under Republic control for most of the Clone Wars, but it was nonetheless one of the most historically significant separatist worlds. It was the birthplace of the CIS droid army, and though other manufacturing centers took over droid production during the Clone Wars, many of the army's existing units were Geonosian made, and many of the Confederacy's other major mech worlds were Geonosian colonies. The Geonosians, under Archduke Poggle's leadership, remained a major separatist faction, and Poggle himself became one of the most important members of the Separatist Council, as he was one of the few council members to have a grasp on military strategy. In the end, of course, the CIS lost the war. Poggle the Lesser was killed on Mustafar, most of the off-world Geonosian colonies were destroyed, and Geonosis itself came under Imperial occupation. The Empire nationalized Geonosis's industrial output, forbade the Hives from making contracts with private entities, and enlisted Geonosian slave labor and the work of Geonosian engineers in the construction of the first Death Star. While in canon, the Geonosians were exterminated by the Empire during the Dark Times, in Legends, the Empire saw more uses for Geonosis beyond the scope of the Death Star project. In particular, the Imperial Department of Military Research made regular use of the Geonosian factories. During the Galactic Civil War, there were a number of engagements on Geonosis, which saw Rebel Alliance forces fight alongside Geonosian warriors. In 4 ABY, after the Battle of Endor, Grand Moff Kane decided to completely withdraw Imperial forces from the southern Outer Rim, and the Imperial occupation of Geonosis came to a sudden end. The planet ultimately became part of the New Republic, and it returned to making droids and weapons for private clients, albeit on a smaller scale than before, though the New Republic had a right of refusal on all contracts. So, that was our look at Geonosis, the birthplace of the CIS droid army. But what do you think? What other planets do you think we should take a look at in depth? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.